thankful for you guys being a part of that. We're grateful to be here with you guys. Just being with you recharges our bats and gives us courage to go back and recharge here with you guys to be able to go back. I had a friend just recently say, Hutz, that's my last name, Hutz, you're nuts to live in a place like that. Yeah, I guess. You got to be a little bit crazy to go live in a place like Chad. Why would you follow Jesus to a place like Chad? It's all about following, really. It's about following someone. It's about following the one. I would say back to you, it's crazy that you would even live out your faith in a place like Linwood or Chester or Marcus Hook. It's crazy. Crazy awesome. You and I are born to follow. From a young age, we're born to follow. We're naturally followed by watching and imitating others. We're told to follow the herd from a young age, follow the leader, follow in the footsteps, follow the yellow brick road. But something happens between childhood and adulthood. We have that Peter Pan moment, right? Where we are told to lead our own life, to follow the dream still, to follow our heart, but lead our own life. The truth, when we showed up yesterday, we totally crashed a graduation party. Sorry for all those graduates that are here. We came in, graduation party was going on, we crashed it. Those pretzels were lovely. The truth is, you won't hear a graduate say, I want to be a follower when I grow up. Or parents don't spend thousands of dollars sending your kid to Followership Academy. That just doesn't happen. Or as parents, we don't want our legacy to be world-class followers. However, we are more followers than we'd like to admit. We're closet followers of various sorts. We follow things from fashion to passion to interests. We follow the lives of the famous sports teams. And you even look at your Facebook or Instagram status, you follow lots of things. While we don't want to be known as followers, we are known by what we follow. You are known by what you follow. We come to church because we want to follow. Right? We want to follow Jesus, the head of the church. We want to follow him. We want to look to him. We want him to meet with us here in church. In a sea of a million things to follow, it's good to ask the question, why do you follow Jesus? Why do you follow this poor, homeless man that lived 2,000 years ago? I'm sure someone's asked you the question, why you follow him? Like I get asked, why would you follow him to a place like Chad? That's what brings me this morning to the book of Matthew. I hear you guys have been studying the book of Matthew, right? In our house, and our kids, we've been reading through Matthew in the evenings. I don't think it's a coincidence, but maybe this is a repeat message for you. And if it is, I'm sorry, but maybe I believe this is the word that God wants to have us to hear today. Matthew is a handbook for followers. Matthew was one of the first, he was part of the founding group of the 3-year academy with Jesus on followership. I will begin near the beginning of the story in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18. Jesus has already begun his ministry. He's not yet well known, but he's going to call some people to follow him, follow with me. Matthew says of Jesus, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. What are they doing? They're casting nets into the sea. Why? Because they're fishermen. And Jesus says to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, Jesus saw 2 other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother. And they're in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. And Jesus called to them, follow me. Immediately, They left their boat and their father and followed him. Do you get the gravity of that moment? Jesus must have been a compelling man. He must have been really compelling. 4 men who are tied to their family fishing business left everything with only 10 words from Jesus' mouth. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And their response is wowing. Immediately, in that moment, they left their nets, their boat, their livelihood, their family to follow Jesus. Let the weight of that sink in for just a moment. Immediately. Jesus was really compelling. Jesus is still compelling today. It might not startle us today, but it would have startled the hearers of that early day to hear what Jesus was calling these 4 men to do. These 4 men were fishermen, right? They smelled like fish. They probably looked like fish. They were low-level, dirty, rung-level people. But these are just the kind of people that Jesus called. What's even more startling is what Jesus is calling them to do. He wasn't calling them a better fishing spot, although that would come in a later story. He wasn't calling them to a better job as fishers of men, as good as that sounds, until you realize how challenging people are compared to fish. Jesus was calling these 4 men away from the only job that they knew to something completely unknown. He was calling them to a career change without any limits or terms. These men wouldn't be going home at the end of the day. They would walk wherever Jesus would walk. They would eat with Jesus all their meals. They would sleep where Jesus slept. They would listen intently to all the things that Jesus would share along the way. By spending time with Jesus, these young men would grow to become just like Jesus. These men knew who Jesus was. Remember, Jesus before this was considered what? He was a carpenter, but he was also known as a rabbi. To follow a rabbi was a lifelong commitment. A student shadowed his rabbi, and a student would resemble his rabbi. Jesus is asking these men to follow him, and that would have been an incredibly high honor. However, Jesus, in his way, he throws this cultural curveball. Rabbis didn't call for followers. It was the other way around. Interested students would pick out a rabbi, maybe a guy that they liked. They're like, I want to follow that guy. They would cast their vote and say, hey, they put in their resume. And oftentimes they wouldn't get their man of choice, but unless they were the star student. But Jesus does just the exact opposite. He called his students to follow him. He wasn't acting like the normal rabbi. Well, that's okay, because Jesus is the rabbi of rabbis. What's beautiful is that in this moment, at this beach, Jesus is mimicking God. Because he is God. God throughout history, isn't he always the main pursuer? Isn't he always the main lover? Isn't he always the one that always goes out first? I love this about this story. That here's Jesus going to them at the boat, at the beach, stinking fish and all. There's Jesus pursuing these men. In the garden, remember when Adam and Eve blew it? God came to them in the garden. He pursued them. Even though they wanted to hide in shame, God pursued them. God called Abraham out of the bush. God called Joshua into the promised land, and he fought the battles for Joshua and Israel. It was God who pursued Samuel and Elijah and Jeremiah and called them out as prophets. You got to admit that as you look back at the history of your life, I know there's moments where you cried out to God and you pursued God, but the scale is ultimately to God, right? As the ultimate pursuer, the lover, the one who's coming to you and saying, come, follow me. And I'm sure you've heard that voice over and over, trust me, follow, come. Jesus is filling his team with guys that would not only have been picked last, they probably would not have been picked at all. When you're picking a team for dodgeball and the recess, you often would pick the guys that are the strongest, wisest, and the most skilled, right? The misfits and stragglers would often be pushed off last if that picked at all. Jesus fields his team with misfits and stragglers. Oddly, Jesus picked the last to be first. It's the paradox of Jesus and his ministry. He picked the most unordinary team of ordinary men to be his followers. Isn't that a little bit comforting? Am I alone in that? He picked me, this nerd, to follow him, to go where he goes. Wow. Later, when questioned, when the same guys, Peter and John, in the book of Acts, the book of the followers, the religious leaders were watching these guys, Peter and John, and look what it said about them. Now, when in Acts 4:13, now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. That last statement's important. They recognized that they had been with Jesus. The rabbi had rubbed off. They saw Jesus in these guys. Peter went on to be the rock of the church. John became the beloved friend of Jesus. Andrew would give up his life for the sake of Jesus, as would the other 12. Why? And then there's you and me. Why follow Jesus? Why not? The God of the universe calls you. Come. The God of the universe says, follow me. What in your life resembles the rabbi? When others look at you, can they see the rabbi in you? When Jesus calls you, he calls you to follow, you to follow. Your calling is to follow. It's not anything else. It's to follow, it's to be with Jesus. Likely you follow Jesus because he called you. The fact that Jesus calls you and me to follow him is utterly amazing. Think about it. Jesus is the only one who completely and perfectly knows you. He's the only one who undoubtedly cares for you. He is the only one who infinitely loves you. Jesus with skin on calls you and me to follow him. Wow. Wow. In essence, Jesus here is popping the question. In my mind, I see Jesus on his knees. He's popping the question. He's saying, will you be in relationship with me? Will you give your life to me? Will you draw a covenant with me? Will you spend the rest of your life with me in sickness and health? Jesus is not looking for a one-night stand. He's not into you just for a few years and then is going to ditch you for irreconcilable differences. That's not how Jesus works. Sarah and I got our start here in Marcus Hook. Bow, bow. Ow, ow, ow. We did. It was 11 years ago. I was in Indiana. She was working here. Ike flew out, spent a week here. We went down to South Street, had one of those chili feet, those the Philly cheesesteaks. Like we feel like you just gained 20 pounds in a moment. And we walked down the street, we went to this Jamaican store and bought this, we still have it in our house in Chad, it's this fish. We went out really happy and smelling like reefer, I think. That started our relationship. And 9 years now we've been married, and it hasn't all been bliss. You remember those first dating years when you were like curious, and you just want to absorb everything about, or maybe you've been in a dating or imagined dating relationship, and you're like, oh, I'm just so curious, I want to know everything about her. You talk on the phone for hours about nothing. And you get to that point where you're convinced, you move from the point of being curious to convinced, like, yeah, she is the one. I'm going to marry her, and we're going to be together for the rest of our life. And you commit, you walk the aisle, you give the ring, you say the vow, and life happens. A week after our honeymoon, we crash and burn. But that happens, right? You got to get back to that curious point again and again and again. And this last year, we've had to get back to that curious point. God had to bring us to the desert of Chad to bring that curiosity back. Jesus doesn't promise that when you follow him, it's going to be easy, comfortable, or, as Aaron says, unicorns and cupcakes. No, it's hard, it's tough. But your first calling is to follow. Not to follow is to rebel, right? Rebellion is the essence of sin. Rebellion says, or sin says, I will do what I want, I will follow who I want, I will do what I want, I call the shots. Either you're drawn to Jesus, to follow Jesus, or you're repelled by Jesus. That's the tension that you see in the book of Matthew, right? Between his followers and the Pharisees. The followers are, wow, I've been looking for this my entire life. And the Pharisees are like, you're changing the system, Jesus. It's about what I do. And the followers are like, I have been looking for this sense of being my entire life. Maybe you're looking for that too here this morning. Be with Jesus. Sick of this doing. Being a follower is all about identity, true identity. Your identity oftentimes gets wrapped up in what you do. I'm a parent, I'm a spouse, I'm a student, or it gets wrapped up in a job title, right? I'm a plumber, I'm a carpenter. What's the second question that people often ask you? What do you do? Yet Jesus calls us to a greater identity, a follower, being a follower. Look at Matthew's story. Look at the moment that Jesus intersects with Matthew. I love how Matthew puts his story in his own writing. And in chapter 9, verse 9, he says, Jesus saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And Jesus says to him, what? Follow me. And he rose up and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, I love this scene. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his followers. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to Jesus' followers, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? And when Jesus heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. Jesus is putting on a slam. Love that about Jesus. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Slam again. He's like bringing the law to them. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Isn't that good news? Isn't that good news, church? What I love about this passage is not the slams that Jesus does. What I really love is that Jesus sees Matthew. See, most people didn't see Matthew. They didn't even want to make eye contact with him for the sake that they might have to cough up some change, right? Jesus sees Matthew. He doesn't care about his job title. He doesn't care about his position. Doesn't care about his history. He doesn't care about his past. He cares about Matthew. Maybe Matthew had a job title that you wouldn't want to brag about, right? It's like today saying that you're a dentist or a parking warden or a telemarketer. You don't give your phone number out to those folks, right? You can give your number out to Matthew. However, Jesus connects with Matthew, and he calls him out. Follow me. And he gives Matthew a new title, a new badge as a follower. Jesus sees ordinary people with labels and reputations. And he doesn't care about people's titles. He cares about people. He cares about you. He gives new titles. I love the titles that God gives us in Scripture, that Jesus gives us. Here's some of these. He calls us sons and daughters. Isn't that encouraging? Especially when you don't have perfect parents or non-existent parents. He calls you his son, his daughter. He calls you his beloved. Isn't that encouraging when your marriage is sour or it's ended? You still have beloved. He says you are his friend. Isn't that good when the whole world leaves you and you have a friend in Jesus? And he calls you his treasure. When your self-worth is like the size of a peanut and you don't feel like a precious stone, you got to remember that Jesus calls you his treasure, the apple of his eye. To Jesus, you are seen. You exist. He knows you live. And he calls you. Come. Follow me. He calls you, not the person sitting next to you. You. Follow. But you got to consider the cost of following. Right? When Jesus pops the question, you're just like, you got to consider the cost, right? There is a cost to following. Most people in Jesus' sandals would have loved the crowds that followed, but Jesus wasn't into the crowds. Jesus was OCD, not the kind of OCD that you think of, but the OCD is like an Operation Crowd Deduction. Jesus was about separating the crowds. He was about separating those faux followers. There's a lot of people who follow Jesus, but they were there for the show. They weren't there for the commitment. Look how Jesus talks about these faux followers in Matthew 8, verse 18. He says, "Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. And a scribe, this is a guy who spent his life copying letters of the law down. He was a really religious guy, and he was compelled by Jesus. Look what he says. He comes up to Jesus and says, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.'" You think Jesus would be like, "Woo, yes, come." Look what Jesus says. You got to think of the disciples. They're like, "Jesus, don't say anything. He wants to follow. Just let him." But here's what Jesus says. Jesus says to him, "Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." But Jesus is really saying, where I go, there's no days in. There's no sleeper number beds. Where I go, I don't know where I'm going to sleep. Another of the disciples said to Jesus, interesting, it says one of the followers, right? One of the disciples comes to him and says, "Lord, let me first go bury my father." And Jesus says to him, "Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead." So some follow Jesus until the going gets tough. But Jesus knew the scribe. He knew the heart of the scribe, that he wasn't ready to commit. Because when the road got weary and uncomfortable, he knew he would bail. Where we live in Chad, I've seen Chad chew up missionaries. People who came in loving Jesus, fired up about Jesus and telling people about Jesus. Chad's an isolated place. Sickness and depression, the slowness and unfruitfulness of ministry can be super discouraging. That's what it's like on the front lines of the unreached. Life can mimic the terrain of Chad. I've seen it in my life where we live in the desert. In my life, my spiritual walk can become just as parched and dry. Chad can chew you up. I don't say that out of pride that we are there, but just how God can sustain us in that. That the desert is not actually a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. God can take us to the desert, to the wilderness, and that's where we are drawn to him. If we are just drawn to Chad, just to flourish in our relationship with God, to be drawn near to God, to follow Jesus better, that makes it all worth it. And if a guy like Mubarak, one guy out of the sea of unbelievers, comes and says, Jesus, I see him in you and I want to follow him too, that makes it all worth it. Following Jesus anywhere is tough. Jesus never promises ease, but he does promise to be with you. Some followers quit when the going gets tough, and some followers are there until there's another excuse not to follow. You see that, like in Jesus' day, the only pink slip out was if there was a sickness in the family or a death in the family. You see this guy using that. It's not that Jesus was insensitive to this guy who's got a dying father. It's just that Jesus is like, I'm only going to be with you for a little while. Your father, he's okay. He's going to die someday, but not yet. Follow me. There's a cost to following Jesus. And often the cost of following Jesus is a loss of comfort and an all-in commitment. And Jesus has his way of separating the crowds from those who are true to those who are foe. And I imagine even here today that there are some that are curious, that you know Jesus. You see the marvelous things that Jesus does. He wows you, but you're just curious. You're dating Jesus. And there's others who are convinced, yeah, I believe Jesus is who he says he is, but you still have some nets you're mending. You still have some nets that you're holding on to. Jesus is saying, I know you're convinced, but let go. Let him go. Come. And then there's some of you who are committed. You've considered the cost. And you know, there's a sign. There's some telltale proof of those who are committed. And it comes to the end of the book of Matthew, in chapter 28. Between Matthew 4 and Matthew 28, Jesus transformed these 12 disciples into a whole new kind of fishermen. And these guys are men who Jesus calls out and say, no, it's not to end with you 12. I'm going to be leaving you soon, but you're to continue on. Followers make followers. Followers continue the academy of followership. Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, Jesus says, go therefore into all the planet, into all the world, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all the things that I've commanded you. We've done life together. We've slept on dirt together. We've eaten bread together. I've taught you all these things. Now go tell them. And behold, I will be with you always to the end of it. What we read about in the book of Acts, which comes after, which is really the book, the Acts of the followers of Jesus, you see these men going into the world, telling the world about Jesus. Why? Because Jesus really is the only answer for the world and the world's problems. Jesus and his followers would then turn the world completely upside down. And today, 2,000 plus years later, we are here sitting in this church because of those men who went into the world to tell the world, and then they went to tell others, and they went to tell others. And today, we are sitting here today, and Jesus is still as compelling, contagious because of this. Because Jesus still changes the world. Because Jesus still changes Linwood and Marcus Hook and Chester and people in it. Jesus still changes Justin. And Jesus is still in the business of changing you. Maybe God will never call you to be a pastor or a missionary or go to the deserts of Chad or the jungles of Brazil, but you guys are living in the jungle of your own right here in Linwood, in Marcus Hook. And this jungle needs Jesus. It's a hurting jungle. And as God has called us as a community of Jesus followers to go into that world as broken people, as needy people, helping other broken people to come along the way with us. Jesus says, you're going to be like a light, a city on a hill. Nothing can blow out that torch. It's Olympic in size and scale. That's the bridge. That's you. In this room, I'm certain we have one of those three kind of followers in the room. Maybe you're curious. You've come to Bridge Church maybe once or twice, maybe 50 or 500 times, and you're still curious. Is Jesus who these people really say he is? Will you accept his call to you today? Will you follow? Or maybe you're convinced. You believe Jesus is who he says he is. You believe all those things. But yet, you got to ask yourself the question, do you resemble your rabbi? Do people see your rabbi in you? Do you still have some nets you have to let go? Or are you committed? A sure sign of a committed follower is one who has other followers behind him, following you as you follow Jesus. In all that messiness, in all that imperfection, coming to the one who is perfect and the one who says, I have forgiven you. Come, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary, all you who have heavy burdens. Come to me and you will have rest. Will you come? Will you follow? Will you be a follower?